All right, the meeting has started, and so has the recording.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for participating today. We are going to talk today about resume building and making a first impression good. Before I, jump into talking about everything, I'll just introduce myself a little more. So my name is Rose, and I'm the development and recruitment leader for Beyond Vision. Beyond Vision is a nonprofit that's mission is to enrich the lives of individuals who are blind or visually impaired through the dignity of work that is appreciated by our community and our customers. But as part of that, we provide these little career talks so that we can share employment help and tips outside of what we do in person in employment. So without further ado, I'm going to begin talking about recruitment. So I've been working with Beyond Vision for two and a half years, a little over 2 years. And most of that time I've been doing recruitment. And so I've seen a lot of different resumes. I've done a ton of interviews in that time. So I want to give some tips about building a good resume. You may find an employment opportunity because you know somebody who works somewhere and they, let you know that maybe you should apply to this job. Our team's great. But even still, not everyone is going to know you. Networking is a great way to find employment. I just want to say that first and foremost. So definitely network, but your resume is going to be the first impression a lot of people have of you. So it's good to make a very impactful resume. There are a lot of ways to do a resume incorrectly, but there's also a ton of ways to do a resume right. So instead of telling you exactly line by line how to build a resume, I'm just going to give you some basic pointers of what the overall resume should feel like. And if you guys have any questions at any point, definitely feel free to drop them in the chat, or there's like a Q&A section too, and I'll give some time a little bit later to answer some questions. But while you have them, put them in the chat. But when writing your resume, keep in mind that no job is ever too small. If you think like a janitor job or a part-time manufacturing job or a part-time job at your school or library or even volunteer work, that's all experience and it's worth something. So don't ever think that any job is going to be too small to be impressive on a resume. Employers really appreciate just showing that you can put your all into whatever you put your mind to, whether small or large. And like I said, volunteer work can be that way as well. It can be very impactful to show that you don't necessarily need compensation to give back. You just like putting your all into whatever you're doing. And this is even true during college. So whether some of you may be in college or college graduates, and these days, just having a degree isn't good enough. I know it sounds crazy. College is hard. I'm getting my MBA right now. I know it's a lot, but unfortunately, employers also want to see some other kind of experience that you have. So having a part-time job while you're in school, an internship, just volunteering on your campus or outside of your campus, all of that is going to put you above the rest. So now, getting into the actual meat and potatoes of your resume. At the very top, again, I'm not going to go through exactly line by line what you should include, but one thing that can be really impactful to include is an intro paragraph. There's a lot of different terminology for this intro paragraph, a lot of different ways to describe it, but it's basically an intro before your resume. But this is not a summary of your resume. It's not a cover letter or an executive summary or whatever anyone wants to call it. It needs to add content to your resume. It's not just a reiteration of your job experiences or anything like that. It's no more than 5 sentences, but no less than 3 sentences of your skills and an experience where you use those skills. So I'll just I'll read an example from one of my resumes. So, an enthusiastic and adept communicator with an organized and efficient system to stay on task and create effective results. Experienced in communicating with a variety of people from personal and educational and professional exploration. Took the opportunity of an open-ended internship with ambiguous directives to use creative thinking and problem solving. Expressed areas of improvements in terms of solutions and helped create a consistent message for the nonprofit. Eager to use a perspective of blindness and a passion for people to help more people living with blindness. So that was an intro paragraph that I wrote for resume. It could use some improvement. It's a little old, but something in there that is important to make sure you include in an intro paragraph is to look at the job description for the position you're applying for. Pull out characteristics like problem solving or creative thinking and relate that to an experience. It can be an experience in your resume, but it doesn't have to be. Like I said, this intro paragraph is supposed to be adding to your resume, not replacing or becoming a summary for your resume. So like in that example, it said, took the opportunity of an open-ended internship with ambiguous directives to use creative thinking and problem-solving skills, expressed areas of improvement in terms of solutions, and helped create a consistent message for the nonprofit. So I'm not saying the name of the nonprofit, I'm not describing when I worked there or anything like that. Like I said, this isn't another entry of your resume. This is just taking those skill words that are in the job description and showing right at the top how you have those skills and an experience you use them in. And this sort of technique is useful for writing the rest of your resume as well. So if you've ever seen a resume or written a resume, you know that one way that you can write a resume is that each experience should have a bulleted list of your experiences and the duties and the responsibilities you had at each position. Of course, you want to be truthful in all of your experiences. But just like in the intro paragraph, you want to go through the job description and pick out skill words from that job description that relate to experiences that you've already had. For example, I'm going to use a line from, again, one of my old resumes. Facilitated interviews with selected Minnesota-grown members and community professionals. So facilitated in that sentence could become coordinated interviews, led interviews, conducted, scheduled and facilitated interviews, things like that. So if a job description says something like you coordinate activities, then you could use the word coordinate. An interview in a broad sense is an activity, or lead activities. Again, you could use the word lead there. And this is important because you're going to want to use the language that the employer is using. It seems like a small thing, but it really makes a big difference. And it can seem overwhelming to think that you have to update your resume every time you apply to a different job. And that can be true, and you should definitely spend time, especially if it's a position you really, really want. You want to make sure and spend time replacing just those skill words and that full intro paragraph to reflect the language that the employer is using. Again, it's surprisingly impactful just to change a couple words. What is not impactful is to create a list of skills. So it's not wrong. A lot of resumes still do that. I see a lot of them. And I'm not going to say, oh, this resume is horrible because it has a list of skills. But it's just not as impactful as including these skills right into your experiences. Employers want to see these skills built into your experiences. They want to see where you've gained them, how you've used them. And again, the intro paragraph is a really great place to put those skills that maybe aren't fitting in other experiences you have on your resume. So maybe you have an experience you do outside of work and it's not related to, or you don't feel like putting it on your resume. You don't feel like it fits anywhere. But you have relevant skills that you learned during that time. You put that in your intro paragraph. Again, that intro paragraph is adding to your resume. And again, just want to iterate, you want to put where you learned skills or how you use them or both. A few other things that are not impactful when writing your resume is to put all of your education. So if, for example, I have an associate's degree and a bachelor's degree and I'm getting my MBA. Once I finish my MBA, I'm not going to put my bachelor's and my associate's on my resume unless it's relevant. So my bachelor's degree is actually in food systems, with like a focus in organic agriculture. So I do something very different than what I went to school for my bachelor's. But if there's ever a position where that would be important, I would put that. But most of the time, the NBA is going to be good enough. And so again, just to reiterate, you want to put only your highest education that you've achieved. And then another thing that's not impactful is to have more than one page. So again, if you put all of your experiences, all of your education, that's going to go off to 2 pages potentially. So you don't need to put all of your experiences, and not every experience needs the same amount of attention or a list of bullet points. You probably want to include it at minimum 3, but as I've said before, no job is too small. So, if you had a part-time job at a library or something, that's not a small experience, but maybe you don't put as much attention towards it as your more recent experiences or volunteer work even that you, did a lot of more dynamic activities. So if it's not as relevant to the position you're applying for, or if you're there for a shorter amount of time than your other experiences, you can put less bullet points. And that's a way to make sure to keep your resume to one page. One thing that's helpful is to put your LinkedIn profile. I encourage everyone, they should get LinkedIn. It's a little clunky, but it's the professional social media that all professionals use. So that's where you put all of your experiences, all of your education, everything you want to put on LinkedIn. And then you can just put a link at the top of your resume to your LinkedIn. And then if an employer really wants to see more, then they can. So that was a lot of information right up front. So before I move into making a good first impression, are there any questions about resume building? I heard a couple come in. Now is the time to put more in the chat, and I'll ask Sarah to read the couple that came in.
Yep. So the first one we have is, why do others that are recruiters say that the intro summary is not necessary?
Like I said, there is a lot of right ways to do a resume. A ton of right ways. So you don't have to put the intro summary. And again, I would hesitate to use the word summary because it should not be a summary. So what other recruiters might be talking about is including a summary that, again, summarizes your whole resume. That's not impactful. That's not helpful to a recruiter. But if you put an intro paragraph where you're adding value, adding more about who you are outside of the activities that are listed, that can be impactful. But it's not necessary. I hope that answers your question.
Right. Another one we have is, how far back in job history should you go?
Like I said, you don't want to list all of your experiences. And I have seen sometimes people handpick the experiences that are more relevant. So let's say your last job was relevant, but your job before that wasn't, but then your job 2 jobs ago was relevant. Sometimes people won't put that middle job there. It then can look like you have a gap in your history. But just depending on the position, if it's a high level position, that's more common. But again, you could put that middle position there and only list the 3 most relevant experiences or responsibilities from that maybe not as relevant position. I hope that answers your question. Are there any other questions, Sarah?
Nope, just those 2 right now.
All right, if you guys need any more clarification on my answers or you have any others, continue to put more in the chat. But for now, we're making really good time. So I'm going to move on to making a good first impression. So even before the interview starts, as I said at the top, your resume is kind of your first impression for people who don't know you already. But after somebody chooses to want to speak to you, you're already making an impression. So you want to make sure to have all forms of communication open and attended to. So if you put your phone number, your email, your LinkedIn, you want that to be open and available, and you want to be monitoring that when you're looking for jobs. I have had too many times where I've called somebody, I can't leave a voicemail. Voicemail is a very important and very professional tool. So if you don't have a voicemail, when you're seeking jobs, it's really important to have one set up so that employers can reach you and that they're trying to reach you. We get so many spam calls all of the time. So that's a nice way of being able to know if it's a spam call or if it's an employer trying to reach you, because most employers will leave a voicemail. Otherwise, I've also sent emails out before and have heard nothing back. And of course, if you're not interested in the position anymore, it's still important to reply to somebody and let them know, I'm, have secured another position, but thank you so much for considering me. You never know what a bad impression could do. You don't know who knows who, or if you might be interested in that job again or that place of employment. And it's always better to be safe than sorry. Always better to be polite, promptly reply to any communications. You shouldn't be difficult to get a hold of in any way. People will move on very quickly. And this is especially true for individuals who seek you out. So if you have a LinkedIn or a handshake, even on Facebook, I've seen individuals reach out about employment, requesting an interview or asking, would you be interested in this job? And it's really important to make sure that if you're open to looking for jobs, that you are monitoring those rather unique but still relevant forms of communicating. So that's a really easy and important way that you can make your first impression even before the interview starts. But during the interview, when someone reaches out, wants to bring you in for an interview, this is the time, of course, to make the big impact. And it can be nerve-wracking, of course, to be in an interview. You're selling yourself, which I myself am not the best at. So, a lot of people can get very nervous around that. So one thing I like to say is do a power pose before your interview. It sounds silly, but there's it's biologically known to that if you sit in one of these power poses, which I'll describe in just a minute, this can boost your confidence. It triggers something in your brain that makes you feel like you can take on the world. And there's two ways to do a power pose. You can do it standing or sitting. And the idea is to take up as much space as possible. So if you're standing, you want to spread your feet wider than your hips, and you want your arms to be out up diagonally from your shoulders, and your fingers as spread as wide as possible. I know it sounds silly, but you only have to hold that for 15 seconds, like you're about to do a jumping jack. That's a good way to describe it. But when you have this pose, you hold it for 15 seconds. You can walk away feeling a little more silly, but also confident. But you can also do this sitting. So again, the idea is to take up as much space as possible. So you want your feet planted firmly on the ground and wider than your hips, just slightly. You don't want to be too silly about it. And then your arms also wide. So if you have like arms on your chair, your arms should be spread left and right, wider than your shoulders. And you can even sit like that during the interview. Your back is straight, your head's up, your stance is wide even while sitting. And again, you can hold this only for 15 seconds, but if you're comfortable, you can also sit like that during the interview to give yourself a little boost of confidence. I'm also going to point out the obvious, but for your interview, you want to dress nice. Make sure your hair is nice, your clothes are nice, you're clean, you're fresh. You want to dress for the job that you want, not necessarily the job that you have or even the job you're interviewing for. So if you are applying for an office job and you work in a manufacturing setting, in that sort of manufacturing setting, you're maybe not dressing the nicest because your clothes are just going to get dirty by the end of the day, but you're still going to want to dress nice for that interview. And even if you're interviewing for the manufacturing position, but you want that office position someday, dress for that office position. It's not going to hurt anything, and you're only going to impress. Another potentially obvious, but I have seen this being a problem during interviews, is to silence your phone. You don't want to take calls during an interview. Yes, that has happened to me before. And if your interview has a portion where you're on a tour, you're not necessarily sitting down and being interviewed, this is still important. This is still a really important time to make an impression. Even when you're not being interviewed, if you haven't gotten the job yet and you're doing any sort of activity with your employer, you want to dress nice, you want your phone off, don't take phone calls, don't have your phone ring. And if you use like a voiceover, a screen reader, anything like that, I have voiceover, I have an iPhone. You don't want that to go off and tell the time really loudly and that you have a message during your interview or at any point during your time interacting with the employer. And another important thing is to read everything and don't lose anything. So during the interview process for Beyond Vision, we always provide job descriptions. We say, look at this part of the website. We provide extra websites that give information, and people still don't read them. It's really important. Read everything that you can, whether the employer gives it to you or you have to go online on their website. You don't need to brag about how much reading you've done, but this is just going to prepare you to be in the right mindset before you go in an interview. And if an employer gives you something, whether it's a piece of paper, a pass, even a business card, don't lose those things. It's going to be really important to hang on to everything. You never know what might come in handy or what they might ask for. And another thing during the interview, during the actual sit-down interview where they're asking you questions, something that can be really helpful is to take note of what questions they're asking you. They're going to only ask you what they care about the most. And whether there's a second or third interview, you want to be as prepared as possible with what they're considering important. Similar to going back to, the resume building, where you're looking at the job description and you're taking note of what the employer is choosing to put in. Most employers, when they write job descriptions or they write questions for interviews or they're asking questions, sometimes even the questions they don't have written down and they just ask you off the cuff are most important. Those are all indicators for what they consider important. And so you should consider them important too. And when you are being asked questions during an interview, don't hesitate to pause. I'll put it that way because it's seen as thoughtful and perfectly acceptable and even desirable for somebody to think about what they're going to say before they say it. Of course, you don't need to wait if you have your answer, but it's so many people, especially when you're nervous, want to talk fast. They want to say the right thing, but you can end up saying the wrong thing more often than not if you don't take a pause to think exactly about what they're asking and make sure that you are providing the information they're asking for. And another suggestion about that is to breathe through your nose, slow and deep. You don't want the employer to know that you are taking deep, steadying breaths. You don't want to be doing some yoga breathing in the middle of the interview. But just like the power pose, this can be a really great way to just steady yourself, take a moment, think, breathe, and it can be surprisingly impactful for yourself and your mood, but also to the perspective of the employer. And then the last piece of the interview that I'll touch on is to make sure you ask questions. Hopefully, most times employers will ask at the end, do you have any questions? And even if they don't, it can be empowering and even impactful for the employer if you ask, I have a couple questions. Is this an okay time to ask them? If they're saying like, oh, thank you so much for your time, whatever, they're wrapping it up. You can saying, oh, I have a couple questions. Would it be okay if I ask them now? Can be really impactful and thoughtful, and be seen as thoughtful by the employer. Some potential questions you could ask, of course, while also taking note during the interview about what they're asking you, it's important to have even potentially a notepad or some unobtrusive way, whether like a Braille reader or whatever you can use to take notes and just jot down if you have a question. Maybe it's not the right time to ask, though, again, it can be impactful even to ask questions in the middle of the interview. But if not, then jot down your questions during the interview, but also have some questions prepared ahead of time. And they don't have to be targeted. I know some recruiters like to say, go on the website, find specific things to ask questions about. I actually find those less thoughtful and less impactful. Some example questions that I like that people ask me are, what does training look like in this position? That's a thoughtful question about somebody who's really imagining themselves in this position. What are my first few months going to look like? Who am I going to work with? Who's going to train me? Are there documentation that I can read that will help me with my training? Those sorts of questions are really thoughtful and always relevant. Another question that's always relevant is, what is the culture like at your company? Even if it's a virtual or remote position, that I actually feel like that's a more relevant question. How do you stay in contact with your managers? How do you interact with other coworkers? What are there activities that the company does? Are there holiday parties? What does that look like? And along the same lines, I've only had a few people ask me this question, but I really like it when people ask, what is your favorite part about working there? That shows interest in the culture, but also in a very specific way. People can talk all day about the culture in a big grandiose way, in a high level way, but when you ask a person, well, what do you specifically like? That makes it personal, and they have to really think about, like, okay, I come here every day. What do I like? What keeps me coming? And then, of course, you always want to ask, because sometimes employers will offer it up, but I'd rather not leave it to employers. And as an employer, as a recruiter, I hate to interject with this. It's good to ask, what are next steps? Again, it's almost can be uncomfortable with having to interject. Okay, this is what's happening next. You need to be prepared. But some employers won't, and then you're left in the lurch and you're wondering, well, what's going to happen next? So always ask. All right, and then, of course, it's important you're still making an impression after the interview. One thing that is very nice, even if they just throw it away or delete it, is to send a thank you note, if possible. Some employers, you have no way of contacting them. It's all virtual or through some sort of system. But if you can, send a thank you note. It doesn't have to be long, and it doesn't even have to be right away. It actually can be a really great reminder of your presence and that you care about this position if you do it a couple days later. And if you don't hear anything back from employers, don't pester them. Some recruiters will say that you should continue to follow up, ask, why didn't I get this position? What's going on? And that can really make a bad impression if you're pushy. It's perfectly fine to follow up, but a lot of times employers will give you some, inane answer about, oh, well, we're still making decisions, or they won't even answer you. And if you continue to pester them, they're still going to see that. They're just going to still keep ignoring you. And they are going to have a bad impression of you. And as I said earlier, you never know what a bad impression could do. The best thing to do after you're done with your thank you note, you're done with your follow-up, is to just keep moving on and keep hunting. Actually, do that immediately, right after your interview. When you're job hunting, the best thing you can do is to treat job hunting like it's your full-time job. That's the best way to find employment, other than networking, which can still be part of your job hunting. Network, let everybody know that you're looking for a job. Let people know on LinkedIn, on Facebook, everybody you can. Network and continue to apply to jobs. And then I just had one more tip that didn't really fit anywhere else. So this is about references. Not all employers do references. And some employers can do references at any point. They can do them before your interview. They can do them after your interview. Anywhere in between. So it's always good to just have good references on hand. 3 is a good number, but it's always good to have more just in case, because you always want to make sure that your references are prepared to be references. I have done interviews where I have called their references and they had no idea that they were even a reference, and they weren't even a good reference. So you want to not only ask first, is it okay if I put you down as a reference? But then when someone potentially could be contacted as a reference, you want to call and let them know, hey, I just applied for this job. They said they're going to do a reference check. They might call you sometime soon. And like I said, it's good to have backups because maybe somebody can't or is hard to get a hold of. Things happen. So it's always good to have multiple. And those were all my points. So we can open it up for questions again. I heard a couple more come in. If Sarah, you want to start with those?
Yep. So I have done several temporary jobs. How should I share that on my resume?
So one thing you can do when you have a temp position or a seasonal position, you can put in parentheses why you've left that job. For example, like my husband, he had a job just for a summer when we were in transition and moving. And so instead of having a gap in his resume, he put that position there, and then in parentheses just said seasonal. So you can do that. In parentheses, just say temporary. I hope that answers your question.
All right. And another one is, if I have a gap on employment, should I list that in a resume? If not, would this have an impact on employers? Would they still consider to go further in the hiring process?
Gaps in employment can be difficult, but not impossible, especially if you've been doing something in the meantime. If you've been volunteering, if you've been doing activities if you're like a parent, you take a break and you're parenting your child. I've seen people put it on there, took a break at this point, as a parent. If you do organized sports with your kids or anything, any sort of volunteering with the school with your kids. So my recommendation is to fill that time with whatever you can think of that you did during that time. And if not, again, the intro paragraph can be really impactful, describing, why you had a break, why you were eager to get back to work, and what experiences that you do have might lend itself to the position you are applying for, even if they were a while ago. I hope that answers your question. Any other questions, Sarah?
That was the last one we had.
All right. Well, we are just a little close to 45 minutes, 41 minutes. So if anyone has any last questions, put them in the chat now. Otherwise, you guys can always reach out to me, Burrell at beyondvision.com, 414-778-5800, and ask for Rose if you have any questions about employment or about employment at Beyond Vision. But otherwise, thank you all for coming today.